The river was a brown, roaring beast, and Emmett Sloan was a ghost on its shore. At 12 years old, he was a creature of edges and hollows, his frame whittled thin by a hunger that had become a permanent resident in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just a lack of food. It was a deeper starvation, a gnawing absence of touch, of voice, of presence. The world, this sprawling, indifferent wilderness, had consumed his parents a year prior in a fever that swept through their isolated homestead like a phantom fire, leaving him the sole, scorched survivor. Now the world was only a threat. The wind was a thief that stole the warmth from his bones, the trees were silent judges, and the river was the boundary of his known universe, a churning embodiment of the chaos that had swallowed his life. He huddled behind a moss-slicked boulder, the worn wool of his father's coat a poor defense against the damp chill that seeped up from the earth. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the opposite bank, a place he'd never been. It was nothing but more trees, more shadows, a mirror of his own lonely prison. His world was this cabin, a dilapidated box of memories and dust, and the few 100 yards of forest he dared to forage in. The hunger was a physical pain now, a dull blade twisting beneath his ribs. He had checked his snares this morning. Empty. The last of the salted meat was gone weeks ago. The jerky his mother had made, each piece a ration of love, was now just a phantom taste on his tongue. He was down to roots and hope, and he was running out of both. It was then, through the percussive roar of the water, that he heard it. A sound that did not belong, not the screech of a hawk or the crash of a falling branch. It was a cry, human, thin and reedy, ripped away by the wind almost as soon as it was born, but it was there. Emmett froze, every muscle tensed. His first instinct, honed by a year of brutal solitude, was to shrink, to make himself smaller, to disappear. People were a memory, and a dangerous one at that. The few prospectors who had stumbled past his land in the last year had eyes like hungry coyotes, and he had learned to become a shadow when they passed. Self-preservation was a prayer he muttered with every breath, but the cry came again, weaker this time, a frayed end of a sound. It came from the river. He peered over the rock, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. There, caught in the rapids, snagged on the skeletal arm of a submerged log, was a figure. An old man, his long gray braids fanned out in the churning water like silver snakes, one arm hooked desperately around the log, the other limp at his side. He was dressed in buckskin, his face turned towards the sky, his mouth open in a silent plea or a final gasp. Emmett's mind screamed at him, "No, go back. It's not your fight. You can't even save yourself." The river was a killer. He'd seen it swallow whole trees during the spring melt. To enter it was suicide. He was just a boy, a whisper of a boy, with no strength to spare. He should retreat to the cabin, block the door, and forget what he saw. Let the river have its due. It was the law of this place. The strong, or the lucky, survived. The weak were swept away. He started to back away, his worn boots slipping on the muddy bank. But the image was burned into his mind. The old man's face, a mask of exhausted surrender. It reminded him of his father in his last moments, the fight finally leaving his eyes, a quiet yielding to the inevitable. Emmett's father hadn't yielded. He had fought. He had told Emmett, "Courage, son, isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right when you are." The memory was a hot coal in his chest. He looked at his own hands, chapped and shaking. What was right? To let a man die? To stand by and watch the wilderness claim another soul, just as it had claimed everything from him? A bitter, unfamiliar anger surged through him, displacing the fear. It was an anger at the river, at the world, at his own powerlessness. He wouldn't just watch. He wouldn't be a ghost anymore. With a strangled cry that was part fury and part terror, he scrambled down the bank, his feet finding purchase in the mud and roots. He didn't have a plan. He had only a sudden, defiant need to push back against the relentless taking. He found a thick, fallen branch, heavy and slick with rot, and dragged it to the water's edge. He pushed it in, leaning his meager weight against it, trying to angle it towards the snag. It was useless. The current snatched it, twisting it from his grasp and sending it tumbling downstream. Panic clawed at his throat. The old man's head was lower in the water now. Emmett saw the last of his strength failing. There was no other way. He took a breath that felt like breathing fire and stepped into the raging water. The cold was a physical blow, a shock that drove the air from his lungs. The current grabbed him, pulling him off his feet, and for a terrifying second he was a part of the chaos, tumbling and helpless. His head went under, the brown water filling his nose and mouth, a taste of mud and death. He fought his way to the surface, sputtering, his limbs flailing. He saw the log, the man, and swam with a desperate, clumsy stroke, his fear giving him a strength he didn't know he possessed. The river tore at him, trying to pull him under, to drag him away, but the image of that face, that quiet surrender, propelled him forward. He reached the log, his fingers clawing at the bark, his body slammed against it by the force of the water. He gasped for air, his chest burning. He was there. He had crossed the barrier. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice thin against the roar. "Hold on!" The old man's eyes flickered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they held not fear, but a flicker of profound surprise. Emmett grabbed the man's buckskin shirt. "We have to get you out!" he screamed over the water. The man's head lolled. He was barely conscious. Emmett knew he couldn't pull him back the way he came. He'd have to get him to the opposite shore, the one he'd never touched. With his last ounce of strength, he worked his way around the log, positioning himself behind the old man. He hooked his arms under the man's shoulders, his own body shielding him from the worst of the current. "Kick!" Emmett shouted, though he didn't know if the man could hear him. "You have to help me!" He pushed off the log, his legs churning, his arms straining with the dead weight of the man. It was a battle of inches. The river fought him, spinning them, trying to suck them down. Emmett's vision began to tunnel, the edges turning gray. He was failing. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned. Just as he felt the last of his energy drain away, his foot hit something solid, a rock. He found another foothold, and then another. He was in the shallows. He stumbled, falling to his knees, but he didn't let go. He dragged the old man the last few feet, up onto the muddy bank of the other side of the world, and collapsed beside him, his body a single, throbbing ache. He had done it. He had crossed the river. He had cheated the beast. He lay there, gasping, the sky spinning above him, and for the first time in a year, the gnawing in his stomach was not hunger, but the exhausted, terrifying, and profoundly alive thrum of a heart that had chosen to fight. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, stumbling pilgrimage. The old man, whose name Emmett learned was Grey Wolf, leaned heavily on him, his breathing shallow but steady. One of his arms was clearly broken, and a gash on his temple oozed blood, but he was alive. A silent respect had formed between them in the shared struggle against the river. Words felt unnecessary. Emmett guided him through the dense woods, following the riverbank downstream, until they found a place where the water ran calmer and shallower, a place where a fallen tree formed a natural, treacherous bridge. They crossed it with painstaking care, Emmett's small frame bracing Grey Wolf's, each step a testament to their combined will. The threshold of Emmett's world, his side of the river, felt different now that he was returning with another soul. The forest seemed less menacing, the silence less absolute. When the dilapidated shape of his cabin came into view, nestled in its small, forlorn clearing, Emmett felt a pang of shame. It was a hovel, a monument to loss. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof patched with rusting tin, the windows like vacant eyes. This was the shell of his loneliness, and he was bringing a life into it. Grey Wolf said nothing, his gaze taking in the small structure with an unreadable expression. Inside, the cabin was even more stark. A single cot, a rough-hewn table with one chair, and a stone fireplace, black with soot. A single, faded photograph stood on the mantelpiece. A smiling man with kind eyes, and a woman whose arms were wrapped around a much younger, happier Emmett. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dust, and sorrow. Emmett helped Grey Wolf into the single chair, the man's weight groaning on the old wood. He then moved to the hearth, his movements practiced and efficient. He coaxed the dying embers back to life, adding splinters of dry kindling until a small, determined flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth was a small mercy. Grey Wolf watched him, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the boy's threadbare clothes, the gauntness of his face, the way his hands, though skilled with the fire, trembled slightly from exhaustion and cold. He saw the ghost of a home haunted by absence. Emmett turned from the fire, his stomach clenching with the familiar pang of hunger, now sharpened by the presence of a guest. He had nothing to offer. The shame burned in his cheeks. He went to a small, lopsided cupboard and opened it. Inside sat a single, heartbreaking piece of bread, a dark crust with a bloom of green mold on one side. It was his last ration, the one he'd been saving for a moment of true desperation. This, he supposed, was that moment. He took the bread and a knife, carefully sliced away the moldy part, and cut the remaining piece in two. He walked to the table and placed one half on the rough wood in front of Grey Wolf. He held the other half in his own hand. Grey Wolf looked at the meager offering, then up at Emmett. His gaze was heavy, ancient. He reached out with his good hand, not for the bread, but he gently pushed Emmett's half back towards him. "A warrior who saves a life shares the honor," Grey Wolf said, his voice raspy but clear. "He does not give up his own sustenance." Emmett stared, confused. "It's all I have. Then we will share this," Grey Wolf insisted, his eyes holding Emmett's. He took the piece of bread before him, broke it in two, and held one of the smaller pieces out to the boy. "It is the way." Emmett hesitated, then slowly took the offering. They ate in silence, the tiny morsels of stale bread a communion in the fire-lit gloom. It was the first time Emmett had shared a meal with another person in over a year. The simple act felt monumental, a crack in the icy wall of his solitude. As the warmth of the fire began to chase the chill from their bones, Grey Wolf began to speak. He spoke of his people, the Nakota, who lived in the valley beyond the western ridge. He described a world Emmett could barely imagine, one of community, of tippies gathered in a circle like a great family, of hunters returning with meat to share, of children's laughter and the wisdom of elders. He spoke of the earth not as an enemy, but as a mother. He spoke of the river not as a beast, but as a lifeblood, a spirit that both gives and takes. And he spoke of his granddaughter, Morning Star. "She has the sight," Grey Wolf said, his eyes distant, looking into the flames. "She sees things, threads of what is to come. She told me this morning that the river would test me, and that a hand would be offered from a world of ghosts. She said I must take it." Emmett listened, rapt. A world of ghosts. That was his cabin. That was his life. The idea that his desperate act was not random, but foreseen, sent a strange shiver down his spine. It felt like a piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was a part of had just clicked into place. "She is waiting," Grey Wolf continued, his gaze returning to Emmett. "She will be worried. My people will be searching." As if summoned by his words, the world outside erupted. The wind, which had been a low moan, rose to a shriek. A sudden, violent downpour began to hammer against the roof, each drop like a thrown stone. Rain lashed against the windows, and a deep roll of thunder shook the very foundations of the small cabin. The storm broke with the fury of an ambushed god, plunging the clearing into a churning chaos of wind and water. And through the roar of the storm, another sound emerged, low and rhythmic, growing steadily louder. Thump, 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 hoofbeats. Emmett's blood ran cold. He shot to his feet, his eyes wide with an old, familiar fear. He scrambled to the window, peering through the water-streaked pane. 3 figures on horseback were crossing the clearing, dark, hulking shapes against the gray curtain of rain. They were not Nakota. They were white men, dressed in oilskin slickers that glistened in the gloom, their hats pulled low. They rode with a grim purpose, heading directly for the cabin. The man in the lead was broad and menacing, even at a distance. As they drew closer, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, freezing it for a heart-stopping second. Emmett saw the lead rider's face. It was a landscape of cruelty, dominated by a puckered, angry scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. It was a face Emmett had seen once before, a man who had tried to claim his father's traps, a man whose name was whispered with fear among the prospectors. Jasper Briggs. The riders reined in their horses a few feet from the door, the animals stomping and snorting, their breath pluming in the cold, wet air. They sat there, silent and ominous, their intentions unknown, their presence a violation. The flimsy cabin door felt like paper. The warmth of the fire, the tentative connection forged over a piece of bread, vanished, replaced by the chilling certainty that the violent world he had tried so hard to keep at bay had just kicked his door in. The fragile peace was shattered, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break within. Briggs dismounted with a heavy thud, his boots sinking into the mud. The other two men remained on their horses, flanking him like gargoyles, their faces shadowed and grim. Briggs strode to the door, not bothering to knock. He slammed it open with the heel of his hand, the wood cracking against the inside wall. He filled the doorway, a behemoth draped in wet oilskin, bringing the cold and the smell of rain and menace into the small, warm space. His eyes, small and dark like chips of obsidian, swept the room. They passed over Emmett with dismissive contempt, then landed on Grey Wolf. A flicker of something, surprise, then greedy recognition, flashed in his gaze. "Well, well," Briggs rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Look what the storm washed in. I heard Chief Standing Bear was missing an old medicine man." Grey Wolf met his stare, his expression serene, betraying no fear. His silence was more powerful than any retort. Briggs's sneer deepened. He stepped into the cabin, dripping water onto the floorboards. "We're looking for a stray bull from the mining company's herd. Seen it?" His question was directed at Emmett, but his eyes remained locked on Grey Wolf. It was a power play, a dismissal. Emmett felt a tremor of his old fear, the instinct to be small, to be invisible. But something had shifted in him since the river. He was no longer just a ghost in his own home. He was a host. He had a guest to protect. He straightened his shoulders, a small, defiant gesture. "Haven't seen any bull," Emmett said, his voice clearer and steadier than he expected. Briggs's gaze finally shifted to him, cold and appraising. "This your place, boy? Sloane's kid, ain't you?" Emmett nodded, his jaw tight. "Heard your PA left you with nothing but his debts," Briggs said, a cruel amusement playing on his lips. "A man ought to pay what he owes, even in death." The words were a physical blow, striking at the raw, unhealed wound of his father's memory. His father was an honorable man. The thought that his name was being dragged through the mud by this brute sent a hot flash of anger through Emmett. Before he could speak, Grey Wolf's calm voice cut through the tension. "The boy owes you nothing. You are a trespasser here. Leave this place." Briggs laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Listen to the old savage giving orders. This land," he said, waving a dismissive hand, "is about to belong to men with vision. Men who can dig wealth from the dirt, not tell stories to the sky. The company has papers." He took a step closer to the fire, his shadow looming over Grey Wolf. "And as for you, old man, your people are squatting on company land. Your chief's been told. He's been warned. Your time of playing Indian in that valley is coming to an end." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This wasn't about a stray bull. It was about land. It was about greed. The faceless, institutional force Grey Wolf had only hinted at now had a scarred, cruel face. "This is Nakota land," Grey Wolf stated, his voice unwavering. "It has been for generations beyond counting. Your papers are lies written on stolen trees." "Lies," Briggs chuckled. "We'll see what the territorial marshal says when he gets here. He's a reasonable man. He understands progress. He turned his attention back to Emmett, his eyes narrowing. You'd be wise to remember which side your bread is buttered on, boy. A smart orphan knows who to make friends with. The implication was clear. Side with us, or be crushed. The storm raged outside, mirroring the conflict within the cabin's walls. Emmett stood between two worlds, the brutal, predatory world of men like Briggs, and the world of quiet dignity represented by the old man he had pulled from the river. The choice seemed impossible, but in his heart it was already made. He had shared his last piece of bread with Grey Wolf. He had crossed a river for him. He took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Grey Wolf's chair. A small, protective gesture. You should go, Emmett said, his voice quiet but firm. You're not welcome here. Briggs stared at him for a long moment, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It was not a smile of amusement, but of predation. He saw the boy's defiance not as courage, but as a challenge to be broken. God's spirit, Briggs muttered, more to himself than to anyone. We'll see how long that lasts. He turned without another word and strode out of the cabin, leaving the door gaping open to the storm. The other two riders cast one last look inside before turning their horses and following Briggs into the deluge. Their hoofbeats were quickly swallowed by the roar of the rain. Emmett rushed to the door and shoved it closed, leaning against it, his heart hammering. The warmth in the room felt fragile again, besieged. He turned to look at Grey Wolf. The old man's face was grim, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. He spoke of the mining company, Grey Wolf said softly. They are the shadow that falls upon my people. Morning Star saw this. She saw men with papers and guns. He looked at Emmett, his gaze intense. The river did not bring us together by chance, little warrior. My fight has now found its way to your door. He reached out with his good hand and placed it on Emmett's shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding. You are no longer alone, Emmett Sloan, and neither am I. But our path forward is now shrouded in the same storm. Emmett looked from the old man's weary face to the photograph on the mantel, to the flimsy door that had just been breached. The world had come for him, but this time, he wasn't just a victim of its whims. He had made a choice by the river, and another just now. He had chosen a side. The loneliness that had been his constant companion was receding, replaced by a new, terrifying, and strangely exhilarating sense of purpose. He was part of a story now, a story that had begun in the raging water and was now heading into a storm of men and greed. He had to see it through. You need to get back to your people, Emmett said. I'll take you. The journey to the Nakota camp was another crossing. After the storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of pine and wet earth, Grey Wolf led the way. They left Emmett's cabin behind, a place that now felt less like a home and more like a waypoint, a memory he was walking away from. They moved west, climbing the ridge that had always been the edge of Emmett's map. With every step, he was walking deeper into an unknown world. The forest changed. The trees grew taller, older. The light filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, like stained glass. Grey Wolf moved with a silent, limping grace, his knowledge of the land innate. He pointed out herbs that could soothe pain and the tracks of a deer that had passed that morning. He was reading a language Emmett had never known existed. As they crested the ridge, the world opened up. Below them, nestled in a wide, verdant valley, was the Nakota camp. It was a sight that stole Emmett's breath. A circle of painted teepees stood against the green expanse, smoke rising from their tops in lazy, white plumes. The sound of dogs barking, the distant rhythm of a drum, and the faint murmur of voices drifted up to them. It was a tapestry of life, of community, of warmth. It was everything his cabin was not. Fear and awe warred within him. He was an outsider here, a boy from the ghost world. As they descended into the valley, people began to emerge from the teepees. Their faces were curious, their eyes following the strange pairing of their wounded elder and the pale, skinny boy at his side. A group of men and women rushed forward, their voices a flurry of concern for Grey Wolf. A young warrior, his face stern and his body taut with muscle, stepped forward to support Grey Wolf's other side. His eyes lingered on Emmett, filled with a deep and unmistakable suspicion. This, Emmett guessed, was Standing Wolf. Then the crowd parted, and a young woman came forward. She moved with a quiet grace, her long black hair braided with eagle feathers, her eyes dark and luminous. They held a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. This was Morning Star. She did not look at her grandfather first. Her gaze went directly to Emmett, and it was a look of such profound knowing, of such startling recognition, that it felt as if she were looking straight into his soul. "You are the one from the ghost lands," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "The bridge between worlds. My grandfather's spirit guide." The people fell silent, their eyes turning to Emmett with a new expression, a mixture of wonder and reverence. Emmett felt his face flush. He was no spirit guide. He was just a boy who had been hungry and scared. Grey Wolf smiled, a weary but proud expression on his face. "He is the one, my granddaughter. He is the one who pulled me from the river's teeth. His name is Emmett Sloan." Chief Standing Bear, a man of immense presence and quiet authority, his face a noble mask of dignity and strength, stepped forward. He listened as Grey Wolf recounted the story of the rescue, his voice growing stronger as he spoke of the boy's courage. He then told them of the riders, of Jasper Briggs, and of the threat to their land. A somber mood fell over the camp. The chief's gaze settled on Emmett. It was heavy, appraising, but not unkind. "A boy who risks his life for a stranger has the heart of a Nakota warrior," the chief declared, his voice booming across the circle. "Our enemies have shown their faces, but the spirits have sent us a sign. Tonight, we will not feast in fear. We will feast in honor of this boy." That evening was a dream. Emmett sat by the great central fire, a plate of roasted venison and corn on his lap. More food than he had seen in a year. The flavors exploded on his tongue, a shock to his system. But more than the food, it was the warmth of the people, the sense of belonging that filled him. He was no longer an outsider. He was a guest of honor. He watched the children play, their laughter echoing in the twilight. He listened to the stories of the elders. He saw the way Standing Wolf's suspicion had softened, replaced by a grudging respect. Later, Chief Standing Bear called him forward. The entire tribe gathered, their faces illuminated by the firelight. "You came to us from the water," the chief said. "You walked on the river of death and brought a life back with you. Emmett Sloan is a name from your past, from the ghost lands. Here, among the Nakota, you will have a new name, a name of honor." He turned to Morning Star, who came forward holding a necklace. It was a simple leather thong, but from it hung a single smooth gray stone, worn into its shape by years in a river, and a single perfect eagle feather. "This belonged to a great warrior," the chief explained, "a man who gave his life to protect our people. We give it to you now. From this day forward, you will be known as Mani Wangyanka, River Walker." The chief placed the necklace over Emmett's head. The stone was cool against his skin. He touched it, the smooth surface a tangible link to this new identity, this new life. A chorus of approval rose from the people. He was River Walker. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a place in the world. The hollow space inside him, the one carved by loneliness, felt full. He looked at Grey Wolf, who nodded with pride. He looked at the chief, who smiled with approval. He looked at Morning Star, and it was then that the peak of his joy was shattered. Her face, which had been serene, was now pale, her eyes wide with a new, terrifying vision. She stumbled, and Standing Wolf caught her arm. "Morning Star?" Grey Wolf asked, his voice sharp with concern. She looked past Emmett, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. Her voice, when she spoke, was a strained whisper, a prophecy of doom. "The shadow grows," she breathed, her hand tightening on Standing Wolf's arm. "I see them, not 3 riders, many, armed men. They carry the long knives, the fire sticks. They are coming up the valley, not to warn, to remove. The papers were the excuse. The violence is the reason. They are coming to burn our homes, to destroy this circle." A wave of shock and fear rippled through the crowd. The warmth of the celebration turned to ice. Emmett's newfound sense of belonging was immediately, brutally undercut by the weight of their collective fate. The threat was no longer an abstract thing spoken of in his cabin. It was here, now, a coming tide of violence. He looked down at the necklace, the symbol of his new life. He looked at the faces of the people who had welcomed him, who had given him a name and a place. Their struggle, which he had only witnessed before, was now his. Morning Star's vision had made it so. The joy of his acceptance and the terror of their impending doom crashed together inside him, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his journey as River Walker had just begun, and it was leading directly into the heart of a fire. The days that followed were taut with a quiet, focused dread. Sentries were posted on the ridges, and the camp, while still functioning, had lost its easy rhythm. Every distant sound, every shadow that moved at the edge of the trees, was a potential threat. Standing Wolf, his suspicion of Emmett now completely transformed into a protective alliance, took it upon himself to teach the boy the ways of the Nakota. He showed him how to move silently through the forest, how to read the signs of the land, how to notch an arrow to a bowstring. Emmett was a clumsy student, his body unaccustomed to such discipline, but his mind was sharp and his will was absolute. He was no longer just Emmett, the survivor. He was River Walker, a member of a people, and he would not be a burden. He spent his hours with Grey Wolf, listening to the old man's stories, learning the history of the Nakota, the meaning of their ceremonies, the deep spiritual connection they had to the valley. And he spent time with Morning Star, who spoke to him not of visions of doom, but of balance. "The world seeks balance, River Walker," she told him one afternoon as they sat by the creek that fed the valley. "Briggs is a man of profound imbalance. His greed is a sickness. Such sickness cannot last. It either consumes itself or it is cleansed." "How can it be cleansed without a fight?" Emmett asked. The image of armed men burning teepees burned into his mind. "Sometimes the strongest weapon is not an arrow but a word," she said, her enigmatic gaze meeting his. "Sometimes courage is not a charge but a stand. You are the bridge. A bridge is not a weapon. It is a path. You must find the path." Her words were a riddle he couldn't solve. How could he, a boy with nothing, stand against men with guns and fraudulent papers? The answer came, as Briggs had promised, in the form of the law. A rider arrived from the territorial capital, announcing that Marshal Bennett would be arriving in 2 days' time to adjudicate the land dispute between the Nakota tribe and the Dalton Mining Company. He would meet with Chief Standing Bear at the base of the valley, on neutral ground. It was not a negotiation. It was a verdict. The news sent a new wave of anxiety through the camp. Marshal Bennett was known to be a hard but fair man, but he was a man of the white world, a world of papers and laws that had so often been twisted to dispossess people like the Nakota. The morning of the meeting, the air was thick with tension. Chief Standing Bear, dressed in his finest ceremonial regalia, his eagle feather headdress a magnificent and defiant statement of sovereignty. A small delegation would accompany him. Grey Wolf, Standing Wolf, a few other senior warriors, and, to the surprise of many, Morning Star. As they prepared to leave, the chief turned to Emmett. "You will come with us, River Walker." Standing Wolf looked at the chief, a question in his eyes. "He is a boy, Chief." "He is the bridge," Morning Star said softly, answering the unspoken objection. The chief nodded. "Briggs will be there. This fight began at River Walker's door. It is right that he sees it to its end. His heart is strong." Emmett's own heart felt like a trapped bird. He touched the stone necklace at his throat. its smooth weight a small anchor in a sea of fear. He walked with them, down the long slope of the valley to the flatlands, where a small stream cut through the meadow. Marshal Bennett was already there, a tall, stern-faced man with a thick gray mustache and weary eyes that had seen too much. With him were 2 deputies and, to Emmett's horror, Jasper Briggs and a dozen other men, all armed, their faces smug and confident. They were the men from Morningstar's vision. They were not there as observers. They were there as an occupying force, ready to enact the verdict they believed was a foregone conclusion. The meeting began, and it was as one-sided as they had feared. Briggs, acting as the agent for the mining company, presented a sheaf of documents, a deed of sale, a survey map, a title registered with the territorial office. They looked official, stamped and sealed. "The law is the law, Chief," Marshal Bennett said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was not a cruel man, but he was a servant of a system. "These papers say this land was sold by the government to the Dalton Mining Company 2 years ago. Any settlement on it is illegal." Chief Standing Bear spoke with eloquence and dignity, of treaties broken, of promises forgotten, of a right to the land that predated any paper. "This valley is the heart of our people. It is our church, our home, our graveyard. It cannot be sold." "I sympathize, Chief, I do," the marshal said, his weariness evident. "But my job is to enforce the title. I have no choice but to ask you to vacate the valley within 1 week." The words fell like stones, a death sentence for their way of life. The Nakota warriors tensed, their hands straying towards the weapons at their belts. Standing Wolf's face was a mask of cold fury. Briggs and his men smirked, their victory assured. It was over. Greed had won. Despair washed over Emmett. He looked at Grey Wolf's heartbroken face, at the chief's noble, defeated posture. Then he looked at Briggs. The man's triumphant gaze swept over the Nakota, and then it landed on Emmett. The cruel smile returned, and then Briggs made his mistake. He decided to twist the knife. "And there's the matter of the boy," Briggs said, pointing a thick finger at Emmett. "He's squatting on company land too, but more than that, he's the son of Daniel Sloan. Sloan died owing me and the company a significant sum, for supplies, for credit. I've got the ledger right here." He patted a leather satchel. "Seems to me, whatever little pittance the boy has, his father's tools, that worthless cabin, legally belongs to me to settle the debt." He was doing it. He was using his father's memory to crush him, to humiliate him in front of his new family. The shame was a hot, suffocating wave. He felt the eyes of the Nakota on him. Was he too a fraud? A boy with a tainted past, a bad inheritance? In that moment of absolute desperation, his mind raced. He thought of his father, not the man Briggs described, a debtor and a failure, but the man he remembered, an honest man, a meticulous man, a man who taught him to read and write, who kept careful records of everything in a small leather-bound book he kept hidden in a loose floorboard under his cot. "A man's word is his bond, Emmett," his father used to say, "but his signature on paper is his proof." And then, Morningstar's words echoed in his head. "Sometimes the strongest weapon is not an arrow, but a word. You must find the path." A desperate, terrifying, impossibly risky idea sparked in the darkness of his mind. A bluff. A lie rooted in a deeper truth. He took a breath. His entire future, the future of the Nakota, balancing on the edge of his next words. He pushed through the circle of warriors to stand before the marshal, his small frame trembling, but his voice shockingly clear. "He's lying," Emmett said. All eyes turned to him. Briggs chuckled. "The boy's scared. It's understandable." "No," Emmett said, raising his voice, looking directly at Marshal Bennett. "He's lying about the debt. My father paid him. He paid everything." Briggs's amusement vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Is that so, boy? And where's your proof?" "My father kept records," Emmett said, the lie growing, taking shape, fueled by the memory of his father's integrity. He kept a ledger, just like you. It's hidden. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, and a man like Jasper Briggs came around claiming debts, I was to take that ledger straight to the territorial marshal. He said it would have Mr. Briggs's signature in it, marking the debts as paid in full. He invented the details as he went, praying it sounded plausible. He said Mr. Briggs didn't like to give receipts, but my father insisted he sign the ledger. He said a man like you, Marshal Bennett, a man of the law, would know what to do with proof like that. A dead silence fell over the meadow. The bluff was on the table. Emmett's heart was pounding so hard he thought it would burst from his chest. He held the marshal's gaze, pouring every ounce of his father's remembered honor into his own. Marshal Bennett looked at Emmett, his eyes sharp and analytical. He then looked at Briggs. The bully's face had gone pale beneath his tan. His smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sheen of sweat. A man with legitimate papers would have no fear of a second ledger. A man who had forged a debt would be terrified. "Well, Briggs," the marshal said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is there another ledger?" "This is ridiculous," Briggs blustered, his voice an octave too high. "The boy's making it up. There's no book." "Then you won't mind if I ride back to his cabin with him and take a look for myself, will you?" the marshal asked. "If there's nothing there, then the matter is settled. But if the boy is telling the truth, forging a debt is a serious crime." The trap was sprung. Briggs was cornered. His lie was about to be called, and he knew it. For a split second, Emmett saw pure, cornered animal panic in the man's eyes. He saw the calculation. If the marshal went to the cabin, even if he found nothing, his own fraudulent claims would be scrutinized. His entire scheme, the land grab, the fake deed, it could all unravel under that kind of attention. The lie had worked. It had worked too well. Briggs's panic curdled into rage. The pretense of law and order vanished, and the raw violence underneath erupted. With a guttural roar, he ripped the pistol from the holster at his hip. "You little snake!" he screamed, his face a mask of fury. He didn't point the gun at the marshal. He didn't point it at Standing Bear. He pointed it directly at Emmett. Time seemed to freeze. The world narrowed to the dark, round hole of the pistol's muzzle. Emmett saw the hammer pull back. He saw the hate in Briggs's eyes. He saw Morningstar's horrified face, Grey Wolf's gasp. He was going to die. He had won the argument only to lose his life. Then, in that frozen moment, came a sound. Not a gunshot. A sound like a hornet, sharp and swift. Thwack, a blur of motion. The pistol flew from Jasper Briggs' hand, as an arrow, fletched in black and white, slammed through his wrist, pinning his hand to the wooden stock of his own rifle slung over his saddle. Briggs screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and shock. Everyone stared at the source of the arrow. Standing Wolf stood 20 paces away, his bow still raised, another arrow already knocked on the string, his eyes cold and steady, aimed at the next man who dared to move. The standoff was broken. Justice, swift and silent, had intervened. The aftermath was a blur of decisive action. Marshal Bennett, his face a grim mask of fury at the blatant assault on his authority, barked orders. His deputies, guns drawn, moved in on Briggs's stunned men, who wisely dropped their weapons. Briggs himself was on his knees, howling and clutching his pinned hand, his reign of terror ending in a pathetic spectacle of pain. The marshal strode over to him, yanking the arrow free with a grim tug and tossing it to the ground before clapping manacles on the man's uninjured wrist. "Jasper Briggs, you're under arrest," Bennett snarled, "for assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder of a minor, and as soon as I get to the bottom of this, what I suspect will be a long list of fraud and conspiracy charges." He turned his steely gaze to the mining company men. "As for the rest of you, you'll be escorted to the territorial line. Your company's deed is now under official investigation. Get out of this valley and don't come back." He then walked over to where Standing Wolf stood, his bow now lowered. He looked at the young warrior, then at the arrow on the ground, and then back at him. He didn't reprimand him. Instead, he gave a short, sharp nod. It was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement of a necessary act. The marshal's gaze finally fell on Emmett. The boy was still standing in the same spot, his body shaking with the aftershock of adrenaline. The marshal's hard expression softened with something akin to admiration. "That was a damn fool thing you did, son," he said, his voice gruff. "But it was also the bravest damn thing I've seen in a long time. Your father would have been proud." He knelt, so his eyes were level with Emmett's. "I don't know if there's another ledger or not, but a man who's telling the truth doesn't draw a gun." Briggs showed his hand. "You called his bluff, and he folded like a cheap suit." With Briggs and his cronies secured, the immediate threat was gone. The fraudulent deed would never hold up under the marshal's scrutiny. The valley was safe. The marshal, before he left with his prisoners, turned to Emmett one last time. "Son, you can't stay here forever. Not really. When this is all sorted, I can find a place for you. A good orphanage in the capital. Maybe a family looking to foster. You'd have a roof over your head, schooling, a chance at a proper life back in your own world." It was the final choice, the explicit offer to cross back over the threshold. He could return to the world of towns and laws, the world his parents had come from. He could leave the forest, the teepees, the people who spoke in riddles and fought with arrows. He could be Emmett Sloan again. He looked at the marshal, a good man offering a sensible future. Then his gaze drifted past him. He saw Chief Standing Bear, his stern face filled with a quiet pride. He saw Grey Wolf, his eyes shining with fatherly affection. He saw Standing Wolf, who gave him a nod of warrior's respect, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. And finally, he looked at Morning Star. She was smiling, a gentle, knowing smile that held no prophecy, only peace. She saw his choice before he even made it. He didn't need to weigh the options. His heart had already chosen. The cabin was a husk. The white world had offered him nothing but predatory greed and a lonely death. This world, this community, had given him a name, a purpose, and a family. He reached up, and his fingers closed around the smooth river stone of his necklace. The feel of it was solid, real. It was who he was now. He turned back to the marshal. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice steady and sure. "But I think I'm already home." The marshal studied his face for a long moment, then a slow smile touched his lips. He nodded, understanding. "I reckon you are, son. I reckon you are." He mounted his horse, tipped his hat to the chief, and rode away, taking the last vestiges of Emmett's old world with him. That evening, there was another ceremony. It was not one of honor for a single act, but one of deep and permanent welcome. The great fire roared, and the smell of feasting once again filled the air, but this time the joy was unburdened by fear. Emmett, Riverwalker, sat between Grey Wolf and the chief. He was given a bowl of stew, rich and savory, and he ate, not with the desperate hunger of a survivor, but with the slow, thankful peace of a son at his family's table. Chief Standing Bear rose, and a respectful silence fell over the gathered tribe. "Today we faced a great shadow," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with emotion. "And the one who helped us push it back was not a great warrior with many coup feathers, but a boy with a courageous heart. He stood for us. He risked his life for us. He has shown that the blood of one's birth is not as strong as the bonds of loyalty and love." He looked down at Riverwalker, his eyes soft. He was offered a path back to the world he came from. He has chosen to stay. He has chosen us. And so, we choose him. Riverwalker is no longer a guest. He is Nakota. He is our son. A great cheer went up from the people. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and acceptance. Morning Star came and sat before him, taking his hands in hers. "The bridge is complete," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You have joined two worlds within your own heart." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the faces of the people who had defended him, who had claimed him, the last of the icy loneliness that had haunted him for so long finally melted away. The hollow place inside him was gone, filled not just with food and warmth, but with belonging. He was Riverwalker. He was a boy who had been defined by loss, who had found a new life in the river, and who had built a home not with timber and nails, but with a single act of compassion and a courageous, desperate bluff. He looked up at the stars, bright and countless in the dark velvet of the sky over the valley. The world was no longer a threat. It was a home. And the peace he felt was not given but earned, one splinter, one scar, one choice at a time. It was the deepest peace of all,